Hi, I'm Scott Miller. Welcome to my Top Performance blog. And today we're talking about deliberate practice, and the person I have the privilege of speaking with is Mike Harloff, who is a psychotherapist living in the self-described boonies outside somewhere in Ontario, Canada. Hi, Mike.
Hey, Scott. Nice to be here with you.
Thanks for agreeing to talking with me about the work that you've been doing on deliberate practice. In the book Better Results, we distinguish between two types of errors that can become the subject of deliberate practice. The first one are random errors. And random errors make up the largest proportion of the variance. And the reason for that is that clients are the wild card of our work. You literally, and in most cases, can't control who walks in the door. So our job in those instances is to accommodate and respond in the moment. Most therapists, however, for whatever reason, and perhaps unfortunately, are interested in their non-random errors. I think it's because, Mike, we're a hyper-responsible lot. We don't want to hurt people. We want to help people. So we're often asking ourselves first and foremost, what did I do wrong? And the first step, as you well know, and the reason we're talking, is that you're going to have to measure your performance to find those non-random errors, those recurring problematic behaviors that we either engage in or do not that have a negative impact on outcome. And dutifully, you have been monitoring and measuring your outcomes. How long have you been doing that?
I've been doing it since November. It's been 2 years coming this November.
And so my guess is that you have a sufficient amount of data for it to start to give us some reliable estimates of your performance.
Yeah, I think I might be up to about 120 closed cases by now or so. Yeah.
And what we recommend in the book, given the psychometric properties of the ORS, it may be different if you're using another tool, is that you have at least 60 completed cases of care. And the reason for this is that your stats are going to be less variable once you've achieved that number of outcomes. And it gives us the opportunity to begin to mine that particular data. You've done that big first step. You've invested several years, and then you reached out and you said, hey, can you work with me and look through my data? And I have to say, Mike, I was blown away by your sheer geekiness.
That nails it too. That nails it for me.
So can you just describe a bit about what you did?
Yeah. So leaping through Better Results and then doing a course that you and Daryl Chow did on deliberate practice kind of gave me that extra nudge I needed. I was still collecting my data through the My Outcomes database. It's all automated for you, which has been really great. But then I realized upon reading the book and taking this course that there's a number of pieces of information. There's a lot of data that's not captured in that automated process through something like My Outcomes. So I made an Excel spreadsheet, and this is right, Scott. I literally was geeking out. And I think I've got probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 columns. I've got 30 pieces of criteria: date closed, what was the SRS difference, and then I've got some pieces that were kind of just of interest to me, such as client description, problem description. And I was entering things that I thought at the start could help me to see trends in my cases that weren't progressing, or the ones that it didn't really go anywhere, deteriorated. That
Interesting. And in the book, you have done what Daryl and I describe as a learning project. You did this on your own. You started to think about, well, what variables might account for differences in engagement levels or outcome with my client? What things am I simply interested in knowing and seeing? Things that might be categories inside my head. Does my data support the categorization this way or not? And you said 30 columns.
about that. Yeah, I think I might have bit off more than I could chew, but I'm happy I did.
And would it be possible to even like look at one of those spreadsheets?
Yeah, for sure we could do that.
Let me just make it possible for you to share your screen then.
Sure.
and not revealing any identifying information about the people that you're working with. Just give us a sense of what you started to do.
Is that showing up on your screen, Scott?
It is showing up.
Okay, perfect. So here it is in all of its glory. There's two spreadsheets. This is the first one. So I've kind of, the first one here is categorized by time, and I've chunked it for every closed 60 cases. So this is basically my way of seeing, hey, am I getting better every 60 closed cases? Am I on to the right path, essentially? And it's
Interesting.
to
So,
see.
so
Yeah.
the first thing, I'm sorry to interrupt, Mike. The first thing you've done is you organized in this first spreadsheet by date, and then you're trying to see whatever efforts I may make to become more responsive and address random errors, or even my deliberate practice efforts to address non-random errors. Let's see after each 60 cases whether or not it's making a difference.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's been such a, it's been quite a long-term project that I haven't even really got to specifying what is my exact deliberate practice I'm going to be spending time on. So it's still, and this has been the really interesting thing for me, that how much time it takes to do this work. You know, we live in a fast food culture. We live in a world that really celebrates and likes things to be just like that, right? Immediate. And so this has been a real kind of disciplined approach for me because I'm not used to taking as much time on any one project, professional or personal.
And can I ask you about that? How much time are we talking about outside of making a living and seeing your clients are traditional clinical practice? I mean, it looks pretty labor intensive here.
Yeah, it's a great question, Scott. It essentially this, so for example, this spreadsheet took from April to mid July, maybe early July. And it's not the thing you want to do when you've got a no-show. It's not the thing you want to do when you've got maybe a half hour in your day you could prep for a client, because you're just punching in numbers and nobody else out there is really doing this. So you kind of feel like a geek, but a geek that's doing something that is unrelatable, or that nobody else is. It just seems sometimes that when you're in the midst of doing this, it's not instant. Yeah, it's not an instant feel good moment. It takes a lot of effort.
And you know, this is something that all Olympic athletes know. Glory happens in the 3-minute race in front of the television audience, but there are years frequently of daily work just trying to shave off a millisecond to build this particular muscle. And you were doing that. I thought it's interesting. I want to lift up this comment. You were doing that during times that maybe you might have a no-show.
Yep.
And this is a recommendation that I've made many, many times. So instead of catching up on your progress notes, which I know is a huge responsibility, or perhaps fiddling around on Facebook or searching the internet for a new pair of shoes or tie, you were doing this wonderful thing of sticking numbers in a spreadsheet.
Yeah, and not faithfully, I will admit. And that's the interesting thing about this process to me, Scott, is I'm a convert to DP and fit, and yet there's always this persistent urge to look up some pair of shoes, or what client do I have this week who's struggling, and maybe I could research better how to help them for my session, right?
Okay.
And I think we all know I could easily fill a no-show with doing my progress notes, for example. But the interesting thing is I'm not taking any extra time in my workday by prioritizing this. It just means that I'm more efficient with the things that are like the notes, the things that need to happen, but somehow it still fits in a workday.
So Mike, I'm looking again at the spreadsheet, and you organize by date, and you did this in, let's say, cohorts of 60 cases to be able to track your progress. And I'm seeing lots of different statistical indices: ORS, initial or last SRS, no shows, cancels, and then can you just say something about these elements, just telling us why you picked them, what your thinking was?
Yeah, for sure. So date closed was to allow me to know how can I categorize this over time and know when I'm hitting my 60 kind of closed case benchmarks. Initial ORS was, I wanted to get a sense of, how do I do, is there any theme on the amount of distress people are experiencing at the start of therapy? For example, do I do better with people who are around like a 12 versus who might start around an 18 or something like that. The SRSs was one I kind of came up with later on in the process that I thought would be interesting to see, and particularly the difference. How do they start? How do they end on the SRS? But what's the difference? And am I getting more responsive? Am I better at this? This is one of my theories. If I could see that I'm actually more responsive to their feedback on the SRS, my theory was that maybe I'll have a bigger difference over time with SRS with people. And then sessions, no-shows, cancels, just was there a trend? The people who do poorly, do they tend to no-show more often? I think that's often been the assumption we have, right? And then these are some of those hallmarks that have been mentioned in better results, such as reliable change, clinical change, clinically significant change. And then as I go through here, I'll kind of scroll over.
Oh my, this thing goes on and on.
It's just endless, Scott. It's endless. If I had this on paper, it would have been almost old school rolls of paper you have in the craft room. So, and then I've got like your effect size, relative effect size. And then I've got some here that I've kind of abandoned. This one I stopped keeping track of. So I work in a medical clinic setting. So people, we have a lot of waitlist issues. So I was trying to keep track of, hey, could I see them? Would people progress better or make experience greater change if I was able to get to them sooner? But just going through the files and trying to figure out when they were referred, it just kind of became one of those pieces that I just felt wasn't necessarily something I needed to pay as much attention to because it was kind of out of my control as the practitioner. Actual sessions, and then days to intake, who referred them, and then I won't go over too far, but the next two categories I have are the description of the client in my own kind of words. How do I think of that client? And then the next category is description of the problem. And then at the end of it, I've got gender identity, their age, and then three things from the TDPA, simply yes, no questions, goal consensus, hope, structure. The last one is my theory or my understanding of why it worked or why it didn't work. And so it's been interesting because it kind of gets me thinking. And at the start, I had to do this really months after I close these people. So now that I've got my spreadsheet up to date, as soon as I close a client, it's fresh in my mind how I think of them, what the problem was. And it's also fresh in my mind as to why I think it did or didn't work. So it does get easier once you're kind of caught up to it.
And so that probably is an argument for doing this in as closely as possible to the time the service is delivered so that you're not falling behind.
Absolutely.
And Mike, I want to just make clear for anybody who's listening, the first thing is you mentioned the TDPA, which is the Taxonomy of Deliberate Practice Activities. This is a tool that Daryl and I developed for helping therapists winnow down all of this data into some small achievable goals. And you mentioned several areas which we know have leverage on outcome, like hope and expectancy and creating a structure and focus, et cetera. If you don't have a copy of that, you can get it via my website at scottdmiller.com. And I'll have a link in the description that you can go directly to that for the download process. And now, Mike, I know that some people also looking at the spreadsheet might say, wow, this is amazing. I'm amazed by it because you created many of these categories after reading the Better Results book. Would it be okay if we shared a blank version of this with the listeners?
Yeah, absolutely, Scott.
So then there will be a link in the description below as well to where you can download this exact, with sans the data that is already in it with these categories. And I would also say, Mike, you'd probably be an advocate that people think before they look and simply adopt your categories about what might be relevant to them.
Absolutely. That's the fun thing with this is that you get to tailor it to the things that would grab your interest. Like what are those details that you want to pay attention to specifically? Yeah.
And as I listen to you talk, here's the instant feeling that I think people might get, and that is getting lost in the trees and not being able to see the forest. Because you got lots of trees here and lots of numbers. And it reminds me of how I do my taxes, which is usually torture. You know, I have all these piles of receipts and I'm thinking, no, maybe this one goes here and that one goes here. And that process takes time. So now you have all of this data. How do you begin to make sense of it?
Yeah, I 100% agree, Scott. That's why I have somebody do my taxes for me. I will show you the other spreadsheet part two. So
Okay.
this is kind of taking the geekiness to the next level.
Oh my.
So this is and I'm showing you right now. I've basically kind of chunked everything and categorized. I've made a second spreadsheet, not from scratch. I'm just copying and pasting and rearranging everything according to the relative effect size. And so it's all categorized by the relative effect size. They basically organize the data from worst to best on the cases, yeah, that just weren't progressing at all. In fact, getting worse too. So they're all red. The top part here is kind of my not applicable. I think all these are basically one session, or there was unreliable. I didn't get the ORS or the SRS every time, so I kind of just, they're up there. I have them up top because my assumption is I'm kind of assuming something didn't work out in those cases as well, but I just don't have like RES or ES data.
Okay.
But so yeah,
so you've fished out your incomplete data.
Yeah.
And you've set it aside. That's one step to make this process of interpretation easier. If you don't have particular data points that are essential to the analysis being conducted, you exclude those.
Absolutely. I just wanted to make sure the data I am working with is actually giving me the best information. So you can see here, this is kind of what we're paying attention to. I've got like the worst RES here, and then I kind of average it out for that group of people. Move it through. Yellows is kind of my caution. Okay, it's not great, but it's not terrible, not as bad. Kind of working my way up to, okay, here's the average RES rate, and then kind of working your way all up through. And then every category of clients, I've kind of have averaged things out to what was the average RES, what was the average effect size, and then all the way up to those clients you get really lucky with, right? They just landed a job after like session 2 or something. You know, I find that's the interesting thing, right? Where sometimes it's a humbling process doing this, because when I put into the category of why it worked, why it didn't work, yeah, there's often sometimes where you have somebody, those 85% of what are those client factors, they just got engaged, they just got a job, or somebody just started working night shifts at home, so their home life is a lot better. You know, there are these interesting things that can account for some of those changes too.
And before we look in detail at this, because I know there's already been something that's emerged from your careful analysis of this data, let's just state for the record that if you look at your overall results, the results that are reported in the outcome systems, your outcomes are solid. In general, on average, you achieve decent results.
Yep.
But this wasn't quite your interest.
That's right. Yeah, this is about being the article I feel like you've referenced before is be compassionate with yourself as personal, but hard on yourself as professional. I can't remember the article's exact title, but
it's Helene Nielsen-Lee's work about love yourself, but not necessarily your results or your work.
Yeah, not look to be reassured or validated, or basically look to find anything to be skeptical about. So that's what this process has been about. And it's actually been very liberating, because, you know, previous to doing this, I would have those sessions that weren't progressing. Somebody would just not show up anymore. And it could have those feelings of, oh, am I doing the right thing? Am I not doing the right thing? And then basically I would switch into, I would talk about that with supervision. My supervision would be useful in helping me to feel better. But then at the end of the day, this is actually what helps you to feel better, to know, have a sense of control over and knowledge over, hey, what is the theme of my area of weakness? And then what can I do about it? What can I actually do to try and improve that?
It's so interesting because, of course, that's exactly borne out by the data. We did an article several years ago called Rethinking Burnout. And the word you just used was one of the chief words, which is control. How do I have control over my caseload? And the second one was, I'd like to feel helpful, and especially with those folks that I know I'm not helping. It's not about drinking more water or doing yoga at work or even going for a walk or eliminating or reducing the number of hours you work. It really is about feeling like you're impacting people through the work. And so let's just step back and review what's happened so far. You begin measuring your results.
Mhm.
You then begin to separate random from non-random errors. And this is critical, because random errors, all you can do is learn to become more responsive to the individual. That's what looking at the graphs is about. I see with this person at this time, for reasons unknown, I need to talk more about goals, or I need to talk about the lack of progress. Here, we've now taken it one step further. You've gathered a large data set. You've now separated them into who was I effective with, who was I marginally effective with, who was I not helpful with, or who may even have deteriorated while under my care. And if we look at these columns, which one should we look at to get to or identify what you have found might be good leads for your deliberate practice?
So, and this is once again has been a really satisfying product or satisfying outcome of doing the geeky numbers, is that it actually materializes into a sense of clarity and a sense of, okay, I think I'm onto something here. So I've always had a hunch, right? And in a moment after a session didn't work out, I would kind of develop these little theories of, oh, I think that's why it failed or not. But then, as you say, that those might have been the things that are one-offs or they're random. So in this graph, looking at the red specifically, and what we came to, the conclusion we came to was these are predominantly male clients. And one of the problems that did seem to come up was male clients. It was problems with things like anxiety or anger, some of those hyperarousal concerns. And interestingly enough, though, I think as we talked about it, it wasn't that it's just a problem with men in general, or men who are looking to, you know, do anger management work, for example, because there's also successful cases with men in anger management. So then we kind of talked about kind of whittling that down even further and talking about, okay, is there other themes here? And the one that seemed to materialize was a lack of structure, lack of goal setting or goal consensus. And there could be something about directiveness here. There could be something about there needs to be more directiveness. And could I share a little example, Scott, of
Yeah,
kind of
please.
working with that?
Yeah.
So, and this is the humbling process of it, right? So that was the theory. So I actually had a session a week or two ago, and a client who would fit that category of those descriptions, there was more distress. And so I basically took the reins that session, kind of knowingly being different from who I typically am as a therapist, but thinking, hey, maybe this is one of those kind of scenarios where I need to be a lot more directive. And at the end, their feedback was, I needed that today. I needed more talking from you, less talking from me, because of just the overwhelm in life. And then as luck would have it, I think what you've noted too in your work is you can't just do autopilot this new change with everybody. You have to figure out who do you do this with and not. I had another client, and I think I was still on this kick of, okay, directive equals good. And their feedback was, you did too much talking. And I like when you ask more questions. So that was kind of like the an interesting outcome, right? Of what does it look like when you experiment with this with your clients?
Okay. So looking at these numbers, a couple things happen. You started to categorize them into the amount of change. We looked at the clients that had a slightly negative effect size, relative effect size, relative to the larger group of clients to which we compare these outcomes. We noticed that it's more men and that the distress levels are higher. And when that happens, they're looking for more direction and less empathy and listening. And this just happens to fit with what the research literature says in general, that when clients are super distressed, our efforts as clinicians to be collaborative, tell me more about that, what would you like, are often experienced by the client as, oh my gosh, my therapist doesn't know what they're doing either, as opposed to adopting a more firm, directive, structured style. I get it. Let's try this. And somehow this actually results in a stronger alliance, which was the second piece of the puzzle, looking at how our interaction via the SRS was related to the lower relative effect sizes. And now you're applying these ideas in the real world, and you've discovered that it's not about doing this in general, but in those particular circumstances where for you, a client who is in higher levels of distress needs more direction.
Yeah,
So it's not about being directive with all men. It's not about being directive with men who might be angry or have a hostile, depressive presentation, but more when they are super distressed. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
What's the next step for you, Mike?
The next step is to, so it's still my working hypothesis. I'm going to continue to examine these, probably my 15 worst cases, and see if I can't get further insights on the growth edge for me. But my next step is to meet with you in a couple of weeks and talk about what learning project I can do now. What am I going to be spending my spare time with, outside of sessions, to really practice and develop, so that I can kind of see if that makes a difference.
And if people are just beginning this deliberate practice journey, outside of starting to measure their results, is there some piece of counsel that you could give them, being directive here, about how to succeed? Because the amount of work is just so impressive, even though you may, well, if we just look at the number of red cases here, we're only talking about maybe 10 or 15 out of your total caseload. Maybe average is good enough. Why attend to those 10 or 15 cases out of the 120? Is there anything you can say, counsel you can offer about how to keep going?
How to keep going? It's a really good question. For me, I'm seeing that it makes a difference. For me, I'm seeing that it's improved my effectiveness between my first 60 and my second 60. So that's been all the motivation for me. And I think that the world of fit really resonated. It was kind of a BS-free zone. I love theories. I love workshops. But I think once you get started in this world, once you've taken what is the blue pill, it's hard to unsee. So it didn't take a lot to get motivated to do it. The hard part is sustaining it. And so I think this is another thing that's been discussed right in your book and in other workshops, is find out a way to automate it. For me, it's no-shows, because no-shows used to typically be that time when I would stew and think, oh no, what happened? Do it during your no-shows. Set aside even a half hour a week. It won't feel like much, but over time, you'll have a spreadsheet like this that you can frame and put on your fridge.
Hey, Mike, thanks so much for talking with me.
Yeah, likewise, Scott. It's been such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.